The ticking of the hallway clock still echoed as my daughter-in-law whispered, she should just be grateful we let her stay out back. Still, I kept folding towels in silence, in the guest house I never agreed to, on the land I still legally own. As her voice carried through the walls, the clock ticked louder, like it remembered what they wanted to forget. While my son laughed along, the same ticking cut deeper, like betrayal wrapped in drywall. That's when I knew they saw me as charity, not family. So I sold the main house, quietly, and let the ticking clock count down for them instead. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Irene stood in the kitchen, her back pressed against the cool marble counter, the faint buzz of Jenna's laughter drifting in from the living room. It was always like this, Jenna, ever so careful with her words, pretending to be polite when her actions spoke volumes. She was on the phone with someone, her voice light, almost mocking. She should be grateful we let her live out back, Jenna said, a quiet chuckle punctuating her words. Irene didn't flinch. She'd long since learned to take the blows in silence. Her son Nathan had told her countless times that family was family. But as Irene listened to the faint echo of Jenna's words, she felt a weight settle deep in her chest. It was a weight that had been building for years, ever since her husband's death, but tonight it felt heavier than ever. Dinner that night was a careful affair, like it always was when Jenna and Nathan hosted guests. Irene had been asked, no, instructed to use the side door. We don't want you tracking leaves in, Jenna had said, her smile too wide to be sincere. Irene nodded, swallowing the sting of it. She had never been one for grand gestures, but this was different. She had built this house with her husband, every brick, every beam, and now she was being told to keep to the back, out of sight, out of mind. The guest house was a nice enough place, cozy, with the mountain breeze rattling the windows at night, but it was still their house, not hers. As Irene made her way through the side door, her fingers grazed the doorframe, remembering the first time her husband had carved their initials into it, INJ, all those years ago. He had promised her that their love would be woven into every inch of this place. It was supposed to be their legacy, a home built to last through generations. Now it felt as if she were a forgotten afterthought. Dinner was awkward, the air thick with unspoken things. Nathan, leaning back in his chair, gave her a nod of acknowledgement. It's more peaceful for you, right, Mom? His voice was steady, but his eyes were already focused on his phone, scrolling through messages as if her answer was irrelevant. Irene quietly picked up her fork and cut through the roasted chicken, her movements deliberate, controlled. It's just the guest house suits you, Jenna added, her smile sharp as she passed Irene a side dish, her eyes narrowing just slightly. The words stung. She could feel the weight of them pressing against her chest, but she didn't react. Not tonight, not here. Instead, she smiled back, her lips curving up as if in agreement. But deep inside, the anger began to rise. How could they, after everything, after all the years spent building this house, this life, how could they treat her like this? She had been a part of it, a part of them. She had sacrificed, loved, nurtured. And now she was nothing more than a guest in her own home. The conversation shifted, and Irene tuned them out, lost in her thoughts. It was easier that way, to retreat into her own mind. The dinner dragged on, the sounds of clinking silverware and idle chatter like white noise in the background. Finally, she excused herself, murmuring something about needing rest. She left the table, walking slowly toward the guest house as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and orange. Her heart was heavy, but there was no room for tears. Not yet. Later that night, as the house fell silent, Irene sat in the dim light of the guest house, her hands resting on the edge of the desk. She stared at the original deed she had pulled from the drawer, its yellowed edges soft beneath her fingertips. Her husband's handwriting was still there, the bold letters of his signature a reminder of the life they had shared. Irene's eyes traced the words again as they had 1,000 times before, but tonight they held new meaning. The house, the land, it was all hers, it had always been hers, and yet she had been pushed aside, her place here reduced to that of an afterthought. She didn't know what to do with the growing fury inside her. Part of her wanted to lash out, to demand respect, to make them see, but there was something more powerful than anger building in her, a quiet determination. Her husband had believed in this house, and now so would she. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool air of the guest house against her skin, the mountain breeze coming in through the window. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew she wouldn't stay silent much longer. And as the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the mountains, Irene made a decision that would change everything. The glow of Irene's phone screen was soft in the dim light of the guest house, a quiet reminder of the world beyond her small sanctuary. She had promised herself she wouldn't look, not tonight. But when the notification from Instagram popped up, Jenna's smiling face, her arm draped around Nathan's shoulder, the table set in candlelight, something inside Irene snapped. It was a picture-perfect scene, the kind of evening that made everything look so right. But the caption was the part that hit hardest, a quiet night at home, surrounded by the ones we love. There was no mention of Irene, no sign of her at all. The words felt like another subtle erasure, another flick of the brush to erase her from the canvas of this house. Irene felt her chest tighten, her fingers trembling as she held the phone in her hand. It wasn't the first time she'd been excluded, but the silence in the caption hit differently this time. She was used to being quietly sidelined to the thoughtless omissions, the unreciprocated gestures. But something about this, about their effort to pretend she didn't exist, lodged deep in her bones. Maya said you weren't feeling well, Grandma, came a small voice from the doorway. Irene turned, surprised to see her granddaughter standing there in her school uniform, the faintest trace of concern in her young eyes. I'm fine, Irene said, forcing a smile. But it was a hollow one, a smile practiced over years of holding back words. Maya hesitated, looking at Irene as if trying to read something she couldn't quite understand. Mom said you probably needed rest, she added softly, repeating her mother's words like they were an explanation that needed no further scrutiny. Irene nodded, brushing past the sting of the statement. But rest wasn't what she needed. No, what she needed was something else entirely. She needed to be seen. Irene stood up, the phone still clutched in her hand as she walked over to her desk where her planner sat. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages. 3 months of unreciprocated kindness. 3 months of asking if they needed anything, of offering to help, of extending invitations that were never returned. She had taken note of it all, small gestures ignored, dinners skipped, birthdays forgotten. She had given so much of herself, and yet all she had in return were empty smiles and polite dismissals. The air in the guest house felt thick with the weight of it, the betrayal like a constant presence pressing down on her chest. With a sigh, Irene closed the planner and set it aside, then rose from the desk, the sharp, staccato sound of her footsteps on the floor echoing in the silence. She walked outside, the evening air cool against her skin, the mountain breeze still carrying a hint of fall's bite. The shed was in the back corner of the property, near the fence line where the trees began to fade into the wilds beyond. She had never had much reason to go back there recently, but tonight something pulled her in that direction. As she reached the shed, she froze, her eyes narrowing in confusion. The door, usually propped open by a stack of old firewood, was closed. She pushed it open, the hinges creaking in protest, and stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was the emptiness. The lawnmower, which had sat in the corner for years, right where it always had been, was gone. The shelves, once lined with tools and supplies, were now strangely bare. A wave of disbelief washed over her as she approached the space where the mower had been. It didn't make sense. She had used it just last week, and now it was gone. Her mind raced. Had Nathan come to take it without asking, or had Jenna decided it was time to get rid of it? The thoughts tumbled over each other faster than she could catch them, but one thing was clear: this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was intentional. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She pulled it out, her hands still shaking as she read the message. We thought it was fine, it's all one property, right? Nathan's name at the top made the words feel all the more condescending, as if he was questioning her right to care about what happened to her own things. Irene clenched her jaw, her knuckles white around the phone. They had crossed a line. She had been patient, she had been quiet, but no more. The game was changing. With a sharp exhale, she opened a new document on her phone and titled it, Unspoken Offenses. She began typing, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who had long known what it meant to be dismissed, to be overlooked, to be taken for granted. Every slight, every omission, every mock. And she had quietly endured over the years. It was all coming to the surface now. She typed quickly, her mind fueled by a quiet but growing rage. There was no more waiting for things to get better, no more hoping they would see her. She had given them time and they had wasted it. But now it was her turn. Irene hit save and stood, the decision heavy in her chest. She would no longer be invisible. Irene stood in the doorway, the familiar scent of the main house now mingling with something fresher, something new like paint and cleaning supplies. The warmth of the house felt distant now, swallowed by the crispness of change. She hadn't intended to stay long, just a quick run to pick up the mail, but the atmosphere inside was like a weight pressing down on her. The first thing she saw was the dining room, Jenna's touch everywhere. The walls had been painted a bold mustard yellow, and Irene's stomach tightened at the sight. It was an abrasive color, far from the soft tones she and her husband had chosen when they first moved in. The old photos of family and history had been replaced with abstract art, colors and shapes that made the room feel alien. Jenna had taken it upon herself to give everything fresh energy, as she'd put it, and the house now looked like it belonged to someone else entirely. Irene's footsteps were soft against the wooden floors as she moved through the space, her eyes scanning the room. The table they had chosen together years ago was gone, replaced by something sleek and modern. It didn't belong. None of it did. She turned toward the living room. Her heart skipped. The wedding photograph, her and her husband smiling beneath the oak tree in their backyard, was gone. In its place hung a large, abstract piece of art, the kind that left you questioning its purpose. Irene felt a sharp pang. She had spent so many years in this room, a witness to birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet evenings spent with loved ones. And now this replacement felt like a quiet erasure. Her chest tightened, everything it seemed was slipping away little by little. She had spent years building this life, this home, brick by brick alongside her husband, but now it was all being stripped from her, taken without so much as a thought. Her hand shook as she picked up the mail, bills, a few junk catalogs. She slid the rest into her bag, but the envelope from the bank caught her attention. She didn't need to open it to know what it meant. The tension between them was mounting, and it was becoming harder to ignore. A voice cut through the stillness. "Grandma, is everything okay?" Irene froze. Maya stood in the hallway, her school uniform wrinkled from a long day. Her brow furrowed, her eyes searching Irene's face with the same quiet intensity she had always had. Irene swallowed, feeling a lump in her throat. She had been trying to keep it together, but it was getting harder. "Some things just need to be recorded," she said, her voice steady, though the weight of it lingered. She didn't want Maya to see how much the changes were hurting her. She didn't want the child to feel the fracture growing between them all. Maya didn't press. She simply nodded, her eyes flickering back to the dining room, to the odd, unfamiliar space where family memories had once lived. She knew something was off, but at her age, the details were harder to grasp. Irene closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence fill the air. Some things were meant to be kept quiet, but others needed to be remembered. She turned and walked toward the study, the room where she had kept careful records of everything, the original house inventory, the things that mattered. Her husband had been meticulous about it all, cataloging their life piece by piece, but now she felt compelled to do the same. Sitting at the desk, Irene opened the old ledger, its pages soft with age. She pulled out her phone and started a new list. Wedding photo removed without consent. She couldn't help herself, it was more than just an item to her. It was a part of her life, their life. She added another line, furniture replaced without permission. Her fingers hovered over the next line. It felt so final, like a quiet declaration of what had been taken from her bit by bit. "Some things just need to be recorded." The thought lingered as she wrote. This wasn't just about things, it was about respect. And Irene knew that as she filled out the list, a part of her was making a mark, staking her claim on what she had built. The house may have been theirs, but it had always been hers too. Irene walked into the coffee shop, the small bell above the door jingling softly as she entered. Celia was already waiting for her at the corner table, a stack of papers neatly arranged in front of her. The familiar scent of roasted beans and warm pastries filled the air, the kind of place that felt like a safe haven, especially today. "Thanks for meeting me," Irene said as she sat down. The weight of the past few weeks was still heavy on her shoulders, but there was a spark of something else now, curiosity, determination. Celia pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose and smiled. "Of course, it's good to see you. I've been going over the deed." Irene leaned in, a mix of nervousness and anticipation rising in her chest. "What does it say?" Celia took a slow breath. "Legally, you own everything, main house, guest house, land, it's all in your name. Nathan isn't even on the title." Irene felt her breath catch. She had known deep down that she had rights here, but hearing it confirmed in black and white was different. The house, the land, everything had always been hers. "You mean I'm in control?" Irene asked, her voice a little shaky. The thought had never been fully realized until now. Celia nodded. "Yes, you've always been in control." She gave Irene a wry smile. "You can even sell it all if you want." Irene's pulse quickened. Sell it? The idea seemed absurd, yet suddenly it felt so real, a thought she couldn't ignore. "Can I sell half the view they take for granted?" Celia's laugh was soft but knowing. "You can sell the whole damn canvas, Irene. Nothing's stopping you, it's your property." Irene took a deep breath, the weight of her options settling in. This wasn't just about ownership, it was about reclaiming her place, her dignity. It was about making a statement. Celia shifted her papers and began outlining the next steps. "First, you need to understand eviction protocol. If Nathan and Jenna don't leave voluntarily, you can ask them to vacate. You don't even need to give them a long notice. 30 days is enough." The thought of pushing them out stirred a strange mix of guilt and satisfaction in Irene's chest. But as Celia spoke, she realized it was what had to be done. She could no longer be a guest in her own home. She swallowed and looked at her friend. "Do you think Nathan will fight it?" Celia's gaze sharpened. "Nathan's not the problem, it's Jenna. She's the one driving all of this. He's just following along." Irene's mind raced. Jenna had always been a presence in the background, but this was something else. This was a battle for control, and Irene had finally realized that her silence had only fed the growing storm. "I'll make my move," Irene said quietly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I won't wait anymore." Celia gave her a steady, approving look. "I knew you wouldn't." As Irene stood to leave, she felt a shift inside herself. The decision was made. There was no going back now. Irene's heart raced as she sat across from Celia in the quiet corner of the coffee shop. The weight of what they had just discussed felt more real now, tangible, almost within reach. Her life was about to change irrevocably. Celia slid a folder across the table to her, the papers inside thick with the promise of something irreversible. "I've listed the house," Celia said quietly, a spark of mischief in her eyes. "As a pocket listing, only luxury buyers, no public MLS." She leaned in slightly. "No one will even know it's for sale until it's already closed." Irene's breath caught, the finality of it almost too much to absorb, but she was already past the point of hesitation. "How long will it take?" Celia smiled almost knowingly. "You'd be surprised, there's always someone looking for a place like this, especially cash buyers who want it fast." Irene swallowed hard. She had spent so many years building this home, raising her family, and now it was slipping through her fingers. But there was something empowering about the idea. No more pretense, no more being second-guessed or invisible. The next day, just as Celia had predicted, a couple walked into the guest house. They were well-dressed, sophisticated, with an air of seriousness about them that made Irene pause. The woman, tall with sharp features, scanned the room with an appreciative nod. Her husband, quiet but focused, watched his wife carefully. "We're looking for a home with character," the woman said, her eyes fixed on Irene. "Something that has history. This place is stunning." Irene watched them carefully, her mind racing. She'd been living here, yes, but the house, the land, had always belonged to her. And now these strangers were standing in it, sizing it up like it was something to be bought and sold. "I'm glad you like it," Irene said, keeping her voice steady. "It's a place built on history, but it's also about what happens next." The woman smiled, her lips curling in a way that seemed rehearsed. "We're prepared to move quickly. Cash offer, no contingencies." She glanced at her husband, then back at Irene. "We could have this all wrapped up by the end of the week." Irene nodded, her heart beating a little faster. She had expected them to offer, but not like this, so sure of themselves, so ready to take what had always been hers. But she didn't feel fear, not this time. No, this was power, she was in control. That afternoon, Irene returned to the guest house, feeling the weight of the decision settling deep within her. As she opened the door, Nathan was standing in the doorway of the main house, his face unreadable. "Irene," he called, his tone forced casual, "you've been using the guest house laundry a lot. Water's getting pricey, you know." His eyes flicked to the side like he was trying to avoid looking at her directly. Irene smiled, the smile not reaching her eyes. "Oh, don't worry," she said smoothly. "I won't be using it much longer." Nathan blinked, but before he could respond, Maya came running around the corner. She stopped short when she saw her grandmother and her father standing together, the tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. "Grandma, you're home," Maya exclaimed, her voice full of warmth, as if she hadn't noticed the strange shift in the household dynamics. She hugged Irene tightly, and Irene felt a pang of love mixed with guilt. It wasn't fair to involve Maya in this, but it was happening whether they liked it or not. As Maya pulled away, she overheard something she wasn't meant to hear. "Mom says Grandma might not stay much longer," Maya said, her voice light but a little unsure, her brow furrowing. She looked up at Irene with a confused expression. Irene felt her heart skip. "Maya, sweetie," she started, but her granddaughter was already distracted, running toward the living room. The words stung more than they should have. It was clear that the reality of Irene's place in this family was shifting, even for Maya. Later that evening, the phone rang. It was Celia. "Irene," Celia said, her voice a little lighter than usual. "I've got an offer, full asking price, they'll close in a week, no contingencies." Irene took a breath, her heart thudding in her chest. This was it was happening. She sat back in the chair, the room around her suddenly feeling like a foreign place, a space she no longer recognized. It was more than just the sale of a house, it was a declaration. She wasn't going to be pushed aside anymore. She wasn't going to live in their shadow. The decision had been made, and it couldn't be undone. The warm sunlight streamed through the windows of the guest house, casting long shadows across Irene's quiet sanctuary. Outside, the sound of clinking glasses and muffled laughter filtered through the air. Nathan and Jenna were hosting yet another backyard event, their guests oblivious to the quiet storm inside Irene's mind. She sat at the small table by the window, a cup of tea in her hands, trying to calm the storm inside. Celia sat across from her, watching Irene with a mixture of concern and pride. It had been days since the house had officially been listed, and now things were moving faster than Irene had anticipated. "You're doing it," Celia said softly, breaking the silence between them. Irene nodded slowly. "It's done, there's no going back now." She had always known this day would come, when she would have to make a choice to stop being invisible in the place she had built with her husband's love and labor. The sale was the only way to reclaim her life, her dignity. She had spent too long watching them take what wasn't theirs to play the role of the accommodating mother and grandmother, but that was over now. Outside, Jenna's voice rose above the others. "You're so lucky to have this place," a woman's voice said, the praise laced with the emptiness Irene had come to expect from Jenna's circle of friends. Jenna's response was sweet, but it made Irene's blood boil. We worked really hard to maintain it. Irene's grip tightened around her teacup. Jenna hadn't built this house. Irene had. She had raised her family here, poured years of love and effort into every corner of the property. Yet Jenna stood there playing the part of the perfect hostess, taking credit for what was never hers. I'll email Ed, Irene said suddenly, her voice tight with the weight of everything she was about to do. She reached for her phone, her fingers tapping the keys with purpose. Please prepare the final transfer documents, privacy clause included. Celia didn't need to ask why. She knew Irene's mind was made up. She had waited long enough. Just then the door to the guest house creaked open and Maya stepped in, her eyes wide with a hint of worry. Grandma, why are you so quiet lately? Irene smiled softly, though her heart ached. Maya always saw more than anyone else gave her credit for. Some things take time to process, sweetie, Irene said, her voice steady but full of emotion. But don't worry, everything's going to be okay. Maya studied her for a moment, then nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. She walked over to Irene, placing her hand on her grandmother's. Outside, the sounds of the party continued, and the thought of Jenna and Nathan enjoying what they thought was their home stung. But Irene felt a quiet satisfaction. They had underestimated her, assumed she was too passive, too kind to take control. The house was hers, and soon everyone would know it. The guest house had become both refuge and prison, a place of solace but also a reminder of everything that had been taken from Irene. She sat at the small desk, the quiet hum of the day outside only amplifying the weight of her thoughts. Her laptop was open in front of her and her fingers hovered above the keys. The digital document she had started was simple, a list of everything. Every statement, every small dig, every silent exile. She had been silent too long, but no more. The first entry was a simple one, but it carried the weight of 1,000 overlooked moments. Jenna, she should be grateful we let her live out back. It was a casual remark, but it stung every time she thought about it. It wasn't just the words, but the dismissiveness in them, the assumption that Irene had no claim here anymore. No right to this place, to this legacy. Irene's fingers moved faster now, her mind retracing the steps of years of quiet concessions. Jenna, we're thinking of extending the kitchen into the sunroom, it's wasted space anyway. The words were simple, but the implication was clear. Her husband's sunroom, the one they had designed together, a labor of love. The place where they had spent countless hours drinking coffee and talking about their future. The place he had built with his own 2 hands. Irene's breath caught as she typed her response. My husband built that sunroom with his bare hands. She had never spoken it aloud to anyone but Celia, but now it felt important to acknowledge it, to claim it in black and white. She wasn't going to let them erase him, erase them. Her fingers paused, hovering over the keyboard. It was hard sometimes to process how quickly everything had changed, how easily they had assumed ownership of something that had been hers for so long. Well, times change, Mom, let's modernize it. Nathan's words rang in her ears, hollow and dismissive. He didn't understand. He didn't care to understand. He didn't see the house as a home. He saw it as a commodity, a thing to be molded to fit his life. His new life, the one he had built without her. Irene closed her eyes, the hurt rising like a tide, but she pushed it down. She had already given them too much. She had been too patient, too accommodating. She was done with that now. The screen of her laptop glowed in the dim light as she updated the buyer's file. Will close in 14 days, quiet transfer still preferred. She felt a strange sense of finality with the words, like the deal had already been done in her heart, even if it wasn't official yet. The quiet transfer, no drama, no fanfare, just the end of a long chapter. Her phone buzzed on the desk beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Maya. You're not moving away, are you? The words were simple, but they hit her harder than she expected. Maya was the one person who had never wavered in her affection for Irene, who had always been her rock. The thought of leaving her, of walking away completely, felt like a weight in Irene's chest. She knew Maya didn't fully understand what was happening, not yet, but the question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken worries. Irene had never wanted to make Maya feel abandoned. She had always promised to be there for her, to guide her through the things she couldn't yet understand. Irene picked up her phone, fingers trembling slightly as she typed a quick response. No, sweetie, I'm just finding a new place for me, and I'll be here whenever you need me. She hit send, her heart aching with the quiet love she felt for her granddaughter. But the truth lingered like a shadow. Maya would understand in time why this had to happen, why Irene couldn't stay in a place that had become a prison for her. As she looked back at the list on her laptop, Irene felt the surge of anger and betrayal fade into something quieter, something more resolute. This was her moment of reclamation. She wasn't going to let them rewrite the past any longer. This house was built on more than just bricks and wood. It was built on her blood, her sweat, her love, and now she was taking it back. The sun had barely risen, but the hum of the title office was already alive with the bustle of final transactions. Irene stepped into the sterile, bright space, the soft click of her heels on the tile echoing through the empty lobby. Celia was already seated, a stack of papers in front of her, her expression calm but knowing. Everything's in order, Celia said, her voice steady as Irene sat across from her. The weight of the deal settled onto Irene's shoulders. This was it, the final step in a process that had begun quietly long before the offer. Irene picked up the pen, her fingers shaking slightly as she signed the closing documents. Each signature felt like a quiet release, as if she were shedding a skin she no longer needed. With every stroke of ink, she was unburdening herself from years of invisible labor, of playing the part of the dutiful mother and grandmother. When the papers were signed, Celia made the final adjustments, sliding everything into place. Irene then transferred the funds into a private trust, her future, her security, and the legacy she would leave to Maya. This was the last act of control she could exercise over a life that had been dictated by others for far too long. The thought brought a quiet sense of peace to Irene. As Celia took the paperwork to the office for filing, Irene stepped outside, her heart still pounding with the weight of it all. The closing wasn't just about the house. It was the end of a chapter she'd tried to hold on to, a chapter she had built with love, and now it was being quietly erased as if it had never existed. But Irene wasn't ready to walk away just yet. She returned home, stepping through the side door of the guest house, the one that had become her refuge but also a constant reminder of how far she had been pushed. The movers were already there, their trucks parked on the gravel driveway, half-empty boxes spilling out onto the lawn. Irene paused, watching them for a moment, feeling a pang of loss that she hadn't expected. Nathan was in the house, completely oblivious to the upheaval happening right outside his door. His attention was elsewhere, probably on his phone, likely scrolling through yet another email or text. Irene moved through the house, each room a soft echo of what had been. She ran her fingers along the walls, touching the frames that had once held family memories. Slowly, quietly, she removed her personal belongings, packing up everything that had been hers, her photos, her books, her little mementos scattered throughout the rooms. In the kitchen, she paused. The house had once been filled with laughter and love, now it felt hollow. She placed the last of the items in a box, then turned to the counter. There, she carefully set down an envelope, simple, crisp, and heavy with meaning. She hadn't spoken to Nathan yet, hadn't confronted him about what she was doing. There would be no scene, no shouting, just this quiet gesture, a note that would speak for her when she was no longer there to say the words. As she walked back toward the door, her fingers brushed over the kitchen counter one last time. The envelope marked with his name remained where she had left it, silent, waiting. Outside, the moving trucks continued their work, unaware of the finality unfolding just behind them. Irene stood at the doorway, watching the last remnants of her life here slip away. Nathan stepped out into the yard, looking confused. He glanced toward the trucks and back to Irene. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice a little too casual. Irene looked at him, her face composed, but the silence between them was thick with unspoken truths. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped aside, walking back toward the guest house without a word. The sound of the moving trucks, the soft hum of their engines filled the air. The knock on the guest house door was sharp, demanding. Irene's heart skipped a beat before she set her teacup down, the delicate porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate, already knowing who was on the other side. Nathan's anger was palpable, Ev. And before he spoke, "What the hell is going on, Irene?" His voice was low but full of urgency, raw with confusion and frustration. "Why are there moving trucks? Why didn't you tell me what you were doing?" Irene opened the door, her expression unreadable. Nathan stood there, his face flushed, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and anger. His posture was rigid, as if expecting some sort of explanation that she was supposed to give. "It was never yours to lose," Irene said quietly, her voice steady but firm. The words weren't meant to hurt him, they were simply the truth. Nathan blinked, his mouth opening but no words coming out at first. Then his anger flared. "You're selling the house, Mom, everything, this is our home. What kind of mother abandons her family for money?" Irene felt a pang of something, regret perhaps, but it passed quickly, replaced by a quiet resolve. She had spent too long being everything to everyone else. Now it was her time to make a choice. "No," Irene said, her voice clearer now. "I'm removing myself from rented respect." The words were soft but charged with finality. She wasn't abandoning anyone, she was finally taking control of her life. Just as Nathan was about to respond, Jenna appeared at his side, her eyes already wet with tears. "You're really going to leave us like this?" Her voice cracked, hurt and confusion mixing into a raw plea. "You're abandoning your family for money." Irene looked at Jenna, seeing the raw emotion in her eyes, but beneath it there was the familiar self-righteousness, the sense that she'd never been truly seen. Irene felt her chest tighten, but she held her ground. "I'm not abandoning you, Jenna," she said quietly. "I'm reclaiming my life, and that's something you'll never understand." She wasn't angry, not anymore. She was done trying to explain herself to people who refused to listen. From the corner of her eye, Irene noticed Maya standing quietly on the porch, watching the scene unfold. Her young face was a portrait of sadness, her small shoulders hunched as if she carried the weight of the confrontation alone. Irene walked toward Maya, the tightness in her chest easing just a little as she kneeled in front of her granddaughter. The others didn't matter anymore. They had made their choices. Maya, Irene whispered, brushing a lock of hair from her face. You'll understand when you're ready. Maya nodded, though the confusion in her eyes remained. Irene reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to her granddaughter. When you're ready, she said again, her voice thick with emotion. Maya took the envelope but didn't speak, her eyes full of something Irene couldn't quite place. Perhaps hope, or perhaps the quiet understanding of a love that wasn't bound by place or possessions. Irene stood facing the house one last time. The silence between her and her family was louder than any argument they could have had. And as she turned to walk back to the guest house, she knew that this time, it was her own future that she was finally walking toward. The guest house was no longer a place of exile. It had become a sanctuary, a quiet rebellion against everything that had been taken from Irene. She stood in the doorway, her eyes scanning the newly renovated space with a quiet satisfaction. The walls, once pale and forgotten, were now painted in soft shades of lavender and cream, calm, welcoming. The scent of fresh paint and wood mingled in the air, a symbol of her rebirth. She had used the funds from the sale to make this place entirely hers. Solar panels gleamed in the sunlight, promising energy and independence. A new garden path wound through the yard, leading to a small stone bench she had placed under the shade of the old oak tree. The flowers were vibrant now, thriving under her care, roses, lavender, and lilies, all blooming as if to mark the change in her life. Irene had spent hours on the garden, pulling weeds, planting seeds, watching the soil transform beneath her hands. It had felt like reclaiming a piece of herself, something tangible, something she could shape with her own hands, not dictated by anyone else. It wasn't just a garden, it was her future, rooted firmly in the earth. She had also bought the adjacent lot, a plot of land that had once seemed too far from her grasp. Now it was an extension of her freedom, a blank canvas to fill as she saw fit, and she had begun construction on something that had been on her mind for years, a small reading nook in honor of her husband, a place where they had once dreamed together, built together. It was a tribute to his memory, a place where she could retreat as he had often done to read, reflect, and write. The nook was simple but full of meaning. She had chosen a spot near the back of the guest house with large windows that overlooked the garden and the woods beyond. Irene had filled the space with bookshelves, her husband's old leather chair tucked in the corner, and a small lamp that cast a soft glow over the pages of a book. It wasn't much, but it was perfect. It was theirs. One afternoon, Maya arrived after school, her backpack slung carelessly over her shoulder. She had visited Irene a few times since the move, but today her eyes were wide with wonder as she stepped into the guest house. She took in the freshly painted walls, the new furniture, the soft light filtering through the windows. It's beautiful here, Maya said softly, looking around with a sense of awe. She touched the armrest of the old chair, the same one Irene had once shared with her husband. Irene smiled, her heart swelling. She hadn't expected the transformation to mean so much to Maya, but it did. It always was, Irene replied quietly, her voice full of tenderness. They just stopped seeing it. Maya gave a slow nod, her eyes glistening with something Irene couldn't quite name. She knew her granddaughter understood. Not just the house, but what it represented. Resilience, a quiet strength, the ability to rebuild, even when everything around you was crumbling. Later that week, Celia arrived with a bag of fresh pastries, smiling as she approached the guest house. Irene had asked her to move closer, and Celia had found a small house just a few streets away. Their morning walks had become a ritual, a quiet way to reconnect, to share stories, and to celebrate the space Irene had created for herself. Celia's presence felt like a grounding force, someone who understood her quiet strength, her need for peace and independence. I never thought I'd see you here, Celia said with a laugh as they walked through the garden together, but I'm glad you're finally making it yours. Irene's smile was soft but genuine. It was always mine, I just had to stop pretending it was. They walked slowly, side by side, their footsteps synchronized in the soft hush of the morning. The world was quiet around them, as if the earth itself had paused to watch Irene reclaim what had always been hers. She hadn't just built a house, she had rebuilt herself. And as they walked, Irene knew this was just the beginning. The guest house was more than a place to live. It was a symbol of her journey, her strength, and her refusal to fade into the background. As they turned down the garden path, Irene looked ahead, knowing that whatever came next, she was ready. Irene sat at her desk, the soft light of the morning filtering through the window, casting long shadows across the room. The guest house, now her sanctuary, felt like a place where she had finally begun to breathe again. The air, once thick with tension and expectations, now felt lighter. She had reclaimed her life, and today she was making it official. Her fingers hovered over the keys as she opened the document, the will she had long neglected. The cursor blinked, waiting for her to make her decision. She had already made it in her heart. Nathan and Jenna were no longer part of he. Our future, the house, the land, the legacy. She had spent so many years giving to them, but it was time to take back what was hers. With a steady hand, she typed their names and in a swift motion removed them from the will. They had no claim to this life she was building, no part of what she had worked for. It wasn't anger that drove her but necessity. They had never understood her, not really. Next, she turned to Maya. Maya was different, innocent, compassionate, and the only person who had ever truly seen Irene for who she was. Irene smiled softly as she typed out the instructions for Maya's trust. It would activate when Maya turned 25. Until then, Celia would manage it. Irene trusted her implicitly, knowing Celia would nurture what she had built. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the right one. Maya would have the freedom to live her own life, free of anyone's expectations. After finalizing her will, Irene moved to her email. She had already received Jenna's apology, a mix of guilt and conditional regret. "I'm sorry for everything," the email started, but Irene could feel the weight of the ifs and buts woven throughout. If only she had been more understanding, if only they had known what she needed. Irene's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she read through it. It wasn't an apology, it was a justification. The words felt hollow. She knew Jenna's version of sorry came with strings attached. With a sigh, Irene hit the forward button. Subject line, "For record only." She sent it directly to Ed, her lawyer, without a second thought. No drama, no confrontation, just a record of what had happened, what needed to be acknowledged. Closing her laptop, Irene leaned back in her chair. The decisions were made. The past was behind her. But she wasn't finished yet. She had spent too long in silence, watching others take what wasn't theirs. It was time to speak up. She opened a new document and began typing, her thoughts flowing onto the page. A guide, a financial resource for older women navigating family entitlement. Women who had been dismissed, overlooked, and silenced. It was time for them to reclaim their power. As she hit publish, Irene felt a weight lift. She wasn't just reclaiming her future, she was helping others do the same. That evening, she checked her phone. Her essay, The Guesthouse Exit Plan, had gone viral. She smiled, the world was listening now. Irene sat at the small writing desk in the guest house, her laptop open in front of her. The house had become more than a sanctuary, it was a springboard for a new beginning. The past months had been filled with quiet work, and now, with the weight of her decisions behind her, she was free to breathe in the silence, to create something of her own. She had always dreamed of writing, but life had pulled her in too many directions. Now her voice was finally finding its place. Her first article for AARP was about to be published. It felt like the culmination of so much, the years of neglect, the silence, the fear, but it wasn't just about her anymore. This article was a blueprint for others, a guide for women who had been pushed aside, dismissed, and forced to live in the shadows of their families. Her words were there for them, a small but significant act of rebellion against the expectations that had shaped her entire life. She stared at the screen, reading through the final draft one last time. The Guesthouse Exit Plan was the title, the plan for women to take back control over their lives, their homes, and their futures. She had poured everything into it, every story of her own, every struggle, every quiet triumph, and now it was ready for the world. As she hit submit, Irene felt a soft sigh escape her lips. There was a quiet sense of relief, but also a sense of purpose. She wasn't just reclaiming her own life, she was giving others the tools to reclaim theirs. A few days later, a woman from Irene's church called her for help. Her voice was trembling with fear as she spoke about her sons who had been taking advantage of her, manipulating her into giving up ownership of her house, her life. Irene listened, her heart heavy but resolute. She had walked that path before, and now she had the knowledge to guide someone else through it. Together, they devised a plan. Irene helped the woman reassign the deed to her home, protecting her from the sons who had never truly cared for her. It was small, but it felt monumental. Irene had learned, after all these years, that peace wasn't something others would give her. She had to create it herself, piece by piece. One morning, a postcard arrived from Maya. The handwriting on the front was a bit messy but familiar. Irene smiled softly as she read the message. "I told my teacher you were my hero. I'm so proud of you, Grandma. Love, Maya." Irene's chest tightened. She hadn't cried in weeks, not since she first moved into the guest house. But now tears pricked at her eyes, rolling silently down her cheeks. I were tears of gratitude, of quiet, hard-won peace. Maya was proud of her, it was all that mattered. She had made a difference in the only way that truly counted. As she sat by the window, the garden outside her guest house bloomed in full glory. The lavender she had planted at the fence line swayed gently in the breeze, its purple blossoms a reminder of the change she had fought for. It wasn't just a garden, it was a symbol of growth, of what had been nurtured and what was yet to come. Irene stood, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. She walked outside, letting the peace of the morning fill her, the scent of lavender in the air, the colors of her flowers surrounding her. Nathan's car drove slowly past the driveway, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. Irene watched, her breath steady. He didn't stop, he never did anymore, but she didn't feel the bitterness she once might have. It wasn't that she had forgiven him, no, it was something else. It was the realization that she no longer needed his approval. As the car disappeared down the road, Irene felt a strange calm wash over her. She had planted something far more significant than flowers in the soil of this land. She had planted her own future, and no one could take it from her again. Irene sat at her desk in the guest house, the evening light spilling through the window, casting long shadows across her workspace. She had built this life piece by piece, and now she was shaping it into something more, a force for change. Her nonprofit to help seniors retain property rights was up and running, and the response had been overwhelming. It felt like she had found her purpose, a way to channel everything she had fought for into something that could help others reclaim their own lives. Her story had spread far beyond the local community, picked up by radio stations and podcasts. As her voice echoed through the airwaves, she felt the ripple of connection, the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore, that others were standing with her. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was for anyone who had been pushed aside, erased. One day, a message from Maya arrived. It was a short note, but Irene felt her heart swell as she read it. "Grandma, I won first prize in the poetry contest. It's about you. The poem is called Where Strength Lives." Tears welled in Irene's eyes as she read the words again. Maya had always been the quiet one, the observer. Now she had captured everything Irene had worked for in one simple phrase: "Where strength lives." Maya's words were more than a poem, they were a testament to the life Irene had built, a legacy of resilience, of quiet strength that would carry on. But as the sun set, Irene's phone buzzed with a message from Nathan. "You won't even let me explain? I'm sorry for everything. Please, let's talk." Irene stared at the screen, feeling nothing but finality. She had spent so many years waiting for him to understand, but the time for explanations had passed. Without a second thought, she deleted the message. No more explanations, no more apologies. She stood and walked to the garden where the lavender bloomed in the fading light. She ran her fingers through the soft petals, feeling the warmth of her peace settle over her. Her legacy was written here in the flowers in Maya's poem. It couldn't be erased. It was hers, and it always would be. The gymnasium buzzed with the chatter of parents and students, the air thick with excitement and anticipation. Irene sat quietly in the back row, her legs crossed neatly beneath her, her hands folded in her lap. The warm light of the setting sun filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The clatter of feet, the rustle of programs, all faded into the background as Irene focused on one thing: Maya. It was her granddaughter's school ceremony, the kind of event parents usually attended with smiles and pride. Irene had never expected to be here with so much distance between herself and the rest of the family, but she had come quietly without drawing attention. She wasn't here to make a statement. She was here for Maya, for the girl who had stood by her when no one else did, the one who had never seen her as anything but the woman who loved her. Irene caught sight of Jenna across the gym, standing with a group of other parents. Their eyes met for a split second, but there was no hostility in Jenna's gaze, just discomfort, a stiff nod that was more obligatory than genuine. It was a far cry from the years when Irene had been part of that world, when her presence had been expected, when she had been part of the social fabric. Now she was a stranger to them, someone who had quietly walked away from a family that had never truly seen her. Maya stood up, her eyes scanning the crowd, and when she saw Irene, her face lit up. The crowd around her seemed to melt away as she dashed toward Irene, weaving through the rows of chairs with a grace that only a child could possess. When she reached Irene, she didn't stop. She ran right into her arms, hugging her tightly. Irene closed her eyes, holding Maya close, feeling the warmth of the hug seep into her bones. It was the kind of embrace that held everything in it: love, gratitude, and an unspoken understanding. They didn't need words. Maya was all Irene needed, and it was in moments like this that Irene truly understood the meaning of family. Not blood, not obligation, but choice, love, presence. "You came," Maya whispered, pulling back just enough to look up at Irene's face, her eyes wide with emotion. "I always will," Irene said, her voice thick but steady. She smiled softly, brushing a lock of hair from Maya's forehead. "Let's go home." They walked out of the gymnasium hand in hand, arm in arm, Irene's heart swelling with the quiet joy of this moment. As they exited, the fading light of the day wrapped around them like a blanket, the world outside just beginning to cool from the heat of the afternoon. It was a peaceful kind of contentment, one Irene had never known but now finally felt like she had earned. As they made their way home, Irene's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to check the notification. The Guesthouse redemption had hit the pre-order charts. The book, her memoir, was out there now, and people were already responding. She had written her story, the story of reclaiming her life, of taking back her dignity and her peace. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was for all the women who had ever felt unseen, unheard. She smiled at the thought, but then the phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Celia. "Dinner at mine tonight, I've got wine, and we're toasting to late starts and clean exits." Irene couldn't help but laugh softly. Late starts, clean exits, they were a reflection of her life, of everything she had been through. She wasn't perfect, but she was finally on the path she had carved for herself, free of the expectations and chains that had once bound her. Later that evening, as Irene sat across from Celia at the small kitchen table, the warm light of the dining room flickering around them, she raised her glass. They toasted to the quiet, to the new beginnings, to the women who found their strength in silence. To the guest house, Celia said with a smile, her eyes twinkling with recognition. To the future, Irene replied, her voice steady, filled with a quiet confidence. The words felt heavy with meaning, but they also felt like freedom. She had reclaimed her life, and now she would live it on her own terms. The future was hers to shape, and for the first time in years, Irene was no longer afraid of what was ahead. Irene walked slowly through the garden, the lavender she had planted swaying gently in the evening breeze. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the path. Every step she took, every flower she passed held memories. The garden had been her sanctuary, the one place where she could breathe, where she could escape the weight of the world. But now it was time to leave. The house, the main house, was no longer hers. She had sold it quietly, no grand farewell, no dramatic exit, just the calm, steady certainty that it was time to let go. The memories of raising her son, of building this place with her husband, had slowly faded into the background. What had once been a home was now just a house that no longer held her. Standing at the garden's edge, Irene allowed herself one last look. She had worked so hard to make this space her own, to find peace in the soil, to reclaim what had been taken from her. But she had built something more than just flowers. She had built resilience, and now it was time to move forward. She turned and walked back toward the guest house, her footsteps deliberate, as if she were leaving behind something that had long overstayed its welcome. Later, she packed a box with old photographs, financial files, and a letter for Maya. The letter wasn't long, but it was everything Maya needed to know. It spoke of strength, independence, and the importance of never needing permission to live fully. "You'll never need permission to belong in your own life," Irene wrote, her pen moving steadily across the paper. She had learned that lesson the hard way, but now she could pass it on. Maya would know even if the world around her tried to tell her otherwise. The box was ready, but Irene's heart felt light. The future was ahead of her, a blank page waiting to be filled. She had given Maya a piece of her past, but the rest was hers to live for the first time. A few days later, Irene stood at the doorway of her new cottage by the sea. The sound of the waves crashing on the shore was calming, grounding. The cottage was small but perfect, just what she needed to start anew. Every room was her own, every corner a reflection of her choices. She had left behind the house, the past, but she had taken with her something no one could take away, her peace. Sitting at her new writing desk, Irene opened her laptop. The words of her memoir flowed onto the screen easily. It was the story of her journey, of reclaiming her life. As she typed the final line, her heart swelled with pride. "My daughter-in-law said I should be grateful to live in the guest house, so I quietly sold the main house and built something no one could evict me from again." She smiled, her future finally hers.